So good morning. I hope you enjoyed coffee. So I'm Sebastian, Seba, this is Bart. We're going to talk about OpenSAMM. So for you who don't know OpenSAMM, it's really like introducing application security activities as part of a software development lifecycle. Right? Microsoft calls this SDL. We call this SAMM, Software Assurance Maturity Model. Now, the project already exists for quite some time. We're going to explain a little bit how it works. This talk is really about what Bart and I have gathered as experience, like what worked and what did not work, and we're going to try to share that experience with you. Okay? So, Bart, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, myself, I'm this. Okay, you can understand this, right? Okay. So I'm a security consultant working at the moment for PwC. I'm mainly working in application security. I've been working on the topic about more than 15 years. I'm mainly involved in security assessments as well as SDLC projects. So applying these kind of models for our clients and helping them to improve their security practices in their company. I'm involved in the Belgium chapter as well of OWASP and in some other organizations here and there.
Okay, Bart. So I'm Seba, or Sebastian. I've become involved in OWASP when I came to the first conference actually here in Royal Holloway, like in 2005, and then started the Belgian chapter shortly after that. Got quite heavily involved in a lot of activities in OWASP, but now really focus on making sure the OpenSAMM project gets pushed forward and making sure that the Belgian chapter succeeds and stays very active. In my spare time and to pay the bills, I work for a company called Torion in Belgium, where I do application security consulting. So what we're going to cover here is very shortly, because I probably assume that you know why we would want to do something like this. Why are we integrating application security as part of an SDLC? We are also going to explain what OpenSAMM is about. We're not going to spend too much time about that because we really want to share the lessons learned with you. What we're also going to share with you is activities and plans on the OpenSAMM project itself. So first of all, why would we really care about application security when building software? Somebody's going to pen test or maybe hack our application anyhow and find the vulnerabilities, that's for sure. So that's indeed what we're seeing. So what we're seeing is that the most of our software is in production, but it has come into production through a couple of phases. So we typically have design phase, somebody thinks of new functionality for an existing application or like a completely greenfield. Somebody actually will build or code the software internally, externally, or we're like downloading components, putting it all together. Hopefully this all gets tested and it's going to be pushed out in production, and software is probably going to be built like in iterations. It can be agile, can be waterfall. So what we see currently is that in terms of application security activities, really what we see is like pen testing activities just before it goes into production. That's always the case, like we're like pushing out this software tomorrow, can you test this, see if there's anything wrong? Or we find vulnerabilities through vulnerability scanning or through incidents in production. We try to put in front like WAFs to protect our software. And hopefully maybe we're like getting better at testing our software well during an actual testing phase, but looking for security problems. Now this is a very, I would say, reactive way of doing application security, because the problems have been introduced in earlier phases, because what we're trying to fight here are design flaws, which are introduced in design phase regarding security, and security bugs. Now these all have been introduced here. So we want to go from a reactive mode to a more proactive mode. We want to build in security activities as part of the building. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's something that we need to make sure our developers and the people in IT that we're dealing with understand. So this really means that we have to introduce like security requirements and threat modeling as part of design activities. We need to introduce secure coding guidelines and provide these to our developers, and not only like provide them these guidelines, but also explain them how that works, provide them training, make them understand how that works. And believe me, that is really necessary. I was like only like last week, I was in front of like 20 developers and I did a quick poll. I asked them, do you know what SQL injection is? About half of them knew that. I asked them about cross-site scripting. None of them had any idea what it was. And they're actually building and pushing out code. So this is necessary to do this. Now, you don't do this overnight. And this, like introducing these security activities is not something you're going to like do in one day or a couple of weeks or a couple of months even. So we need a structured way to introduce this. So hence we need to introduce what we call a secure development lifecycle, and that's where SAMM comes into the picture. So what we really need to do is we need to build like a maturity model, because like building in these application security activities is like a hard thing to do, and there's a number of reasons for that. So we need to change the way people are working, and as you know, people are really resistant to change. So you cannot do this like a big bang approach, unless there was really like an incident and like a very hard push top down to change things. You're going to meet resistance. So we need like an iterative way to introduce these kind of changes in how we develop and build code and deploy code. What we also see is there is no single recipe and there is no silver bullet here. There's nowhere there will be a silver bullet for secure software. But what we need to have is a solution that we can tune towards our organization, that we can also like adapt to the risk level of the different applications that we're building and deploying. What we also need to make sure in our secure development lifecycle solution is that it's clear for the people who are involved, that it really describes pretty well what people are supposed to do. Because this is quite a huge and complex problem. So it has to provide a lot of details for non-security people. And we know from experience and from you being here in this kind of conference how this works. But if you explain this to IT managers, operations people, developers, it's quite a hard problem. And overall, and that's the most important thing, it has to be measurable. We have to make sure that we can start measuring these application security activities, and that's where SAMM really is well at. It's a maturity model. It allows us to measure application security activities, and by measuring, you can manage that. And that's what SAMM really is about. So Bart's going to explain you more.
Yeah. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Okay. First of all, there's quite a bit of companies that are using SAMM in practice already today as we speak. We've been involved in some projects here and there. There's quite a bit of companies that really don't want to share what they are doing in terms of software security practices. So there's definitely many more than these companies listed here. Let's do a quick poll. Who has been using, who is familiar with OpenSAMM and who has been using it in the organization itself? Okay, there's like 4, 5, 6, 7 people. So you'll see the model itself, it's being used quite a bit, and actually we're setting up a system to monitor and to measure what companies are being using these kind of models to improve their practices. Now let's talk a little bit about how the model in itself is structured. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's important that you understand the basics, the fundamentals of it. So SAMM as a model is structured in a hierarchical way. At the highest level, you have these business functions, and these are kind of activities or concerns that a company should take into account when developing or when using software in a company. You will see these functions are typically things that a company has to do anyway when using this software. And as such, these functions are well aligned, typically well aligned into how a company operates or is structured in organizational teams and things. So for instance, construction is about developing software, while verification is about making sure that the quality of the software is appropriate. So the construction function is typically linked to development teams in an organization, while the verification function is typically linked to QA people in an organization. So in that sense, this is actually the link of the OpenSAMM model towards the organization. Under these business functions, you have the security practices, and this is really where the security-specific activities come into play. And these things are defined as activities that, as things that companies have to implement in order to improve their software security into the organization. And so you see that for every function, there's 3 security practices being defined here. Very important, so the link between the functions and the practices is actually how you can apply security activities into an organization. Because the functions, they represent how the company is structured, while the practices, they are actually the core structure for the activities, the software security activities themselves. Now, every practice in itself has a number of concrete activities that can be implemented in an organization. And let's take an example here. For instance, the security practice education and guidance. It has a number of activities that can be implemented. And actually, every security practice is organized into different maturity levels. And this is really where the maturity model comes into play. So you have different maturity levels increasing every time. So at the most basic level, there's a number of activities that you can do. In this case, for this example, for education and guidance, you could, for instance, make sure that there's generic awareness training to developers, so that such that developers are aware what security is, what problems they might face, things like that in software. And at the same time, you can build technical guidelines like coding guidelines and these kind of things for developers to make sure that they use the proper practices when developing software. At the next level, you can see, for instance, that the training that was implemented in or provided in the first level becomes role specific. So you start distinguishing between different roles in the organization, like developers, architects, program managers, or project managers, and you start giving role-specific training. So in that sense, it's a more advanced activity compared to the basic activities. And this is the way in which all these security practices are set up. So you have different activities, and they are ordered in terms of maturity levels. Okay. This is not where it stops. Actually, OpenSAMM per security practice and per level defines a number of things. So we've seen objectives and activities, what you want to achieve and what activities you can implement. But also it specifies, for instance, what results do you expect to come out of these activities. If you have technical guidelines, you expect coding standards to come out of this kind of activity. So OpenSAMM specifies concretely what results you can expect. It specifies also, for instance, metrics. How can you measure that an activity is correctly running inside of an organization? It specifies costs. How much will it cost in terms of money, in terms of personnel, how many mandates, things like that. And very important as well, it also specifies what other activities are linked to this. If you're giving training on coding, you first have to make sure that you have some coding guidelines available. If you're doing code review, typically you want to do that based on coding guidelines. So you first have to specify these coding guidelines, and based on that, you can do code review. You will see later in this talk that the things that OpenSAMM specifies here is really important in order to implement an OpenSAMM or software assurance model into the organization. And we'll come back to that later. Okay, back to Seba.
So when you first download and you read through the document, which I obviously highly recommend, it requires quite like it's a steep learning curve. It's a deep delve directly into all these activities and very well designed, so very accessible. That's for sure. Praveer, who created the document, did a good job at that. But what it lacks and what we're going to improve in the next version is we're going to start to add like a quick start. So how do you really start with applying like SAMM on your software development lifecycle? So what the quick start is really about is it's based out of 4 steps that you iterate. So first of all, you need to assess where you are right now. Yes. So there's questionnaires in SAMM that will help you, that will guide you to do that, so that you can assess what current level are you for this 12 security practices throughout your organization, or your business unit, or your development team that you're assessing it on. So once you know where you are, the next step is, okay, what's our goal? Where do we need to be? So that is our to-be situation. Now, how do you define that? We don't simply invent or have a wish list. Okay, I want to be like SAMM level 3 for education and guidance. This will heavily depend on what kind of software you're going to create, or you're developing, or you're deploying, yes, or what kind of risk level your organization is at. So, but what this will bring you is like really the gap. And I'm pretty sure that here your goal will be quite higher than where you are. Otherwise you would not be doing this, yes. So once you have that gap between the as is and the to be, this really brings you the possibility to start or plan to get from where you are to where you want to be. And that is in SAMM what we call building a roadmap. And SAMM is very good for that because it really defines, like you saw in education and guidance, the activities to reach those maturity levels. So, and these are the building blocks to build that roadmap. Yes. Now, that's the plan. We're still working like on paper between brackets. The next step and the most important step is implementing this. And this is where OpenSAMM will not help you. This is really where the rest of OWASP resources will help you. This is where the actual work has to be done. So, and doing this and kickstarting this process is really like how you start improving your software development lifecycle in terms of security. Okay? So, first, how do you do this assessment? Like I said, there's questionnaires available within the SAMM guides. There's also like Excel spreadsheets you can download from the SAMM website to do this. I'll even point you to an online resource to do this. And it's not hard. So this assessment, what it does is it really goes through a couple of questions for each of the security practices. And like here we've taken, for example, the same like education and guidance related assessment, where you have here the questions. So have most developers been given high-level security awareness training? If they have, this is a yes. If they have not, it's a no. It's quite simple, yes. Does the project team, do they have secure development best practice and guidance available? You can ask them. If they don't, it's a no. If they have, it's a yes. Now, if you have 2 yeses here, you're actually already at level 1, unlocked level 1. So, and this is how you really like start measuring by doing this assessment. And this is like, you can do this in a couple of hours, depending if you have the people available to calculate the level on each of these security practices. And you cannot have like a level 2 if you lack level 1 activities. And so that's the way normally the maturity level is being calculated. Okay. So it seems simple, but when you start doing this in a big organization, can be quite like a challenge. And that's really where we want to share our lessons learned here. So on an organization-wide, before really you start to assess like software security maturity, it's always a good thing to first look at the overall maturity level of the actual software development activity. Because if they are not organized, and if they're like person A does whatever he wants to do, and team B like downloads all kinds of modules and pushes it out and like whatever way they want, and they're not working in a mature way or not in an organized way, from time to time we feel like we are bringing in activities that are more mature than their like proper software development processes. So it's very hard if the software process is not like well organized before to also bring in like maturity increasing activities from a security standpoint. So that is something you have to check up front. Pre-screen like the software development activities themselves. Now, back to SAMM activity measurements, the first thing you will notice is then if you're going to do this on like your own organization and it's quite big and you start filling in these questions, is like for different teams and for different technology stacks, you're going to have different answers. So it's really hard to like, so what's my SAMM level there? So what's really important here when you're doing this scoping and building roadmaps is to set your scope from the beginning. What am I going to focus on? So, and here there's several options. So am I going to deploy this organization-wide and like measure this, start measuring this organization-wide? Then you will see that a couple of the activities or the security practices that you're measuring make sense on an organization level, but some will not make like sense on an organization level. So if you're working on like construction and coding guidelines, well, the C development or the .NET developments will have different maturity levels and different guidance than, for instance, a Java team. Or you might have several operations groups that are working on several stacks of software. So you'll have different SAMM levels there. So you have to tune or scope your assessment towards the division or the group you're working with. Yes, that's really important. Otherwise, your assessment will not make sense. Is that clear? So this is both true for development. What we see a lot is that we have a lot of organizations that are not developing internally anymore, so that you have to do like the assessment on their suppliers. And they have several suppliers, so you have several assessments. Where in terms of deployment, you might have internal hosting or external hosting, cloud hosting, so you will have several assessment activities there. Really important here, what we've learned is make sure you involve the key stakeholders of the software development lifecycle. Don't only go to the developer, but go to the manager of the developers, to the IT manager, to the head of operations, so that they know, that they understand what you're doing. If you don't get their involvement, you're going to fail. Yes. And this is really also the point where you can like pitch them what you're doing. Make sure that they're understanding why you're doing it. So from another couple of points like lessons learned, doing assessments is how to organize these interviews or assessment sessions themselves and how to score really. So you cannot like, or it's, unless it's a really small organization, you will not find it possible to do like the complete questionnaire with one person because it covers really a lot of activities, like from governance, construction verification until deployment. So you'll probably have to involve people from risk management, from development, from QA, and operations. And what you need to do is you need to tune the questions, the set of questions, obviously to the people that are in front of you. It's quite straightforward, but that's not really explained in SAMM, so you have to implement this yourself. What you also have is, what you cannot do is simply send them the question list and say, well, fill this in and send that back to me. They're probably not going to understand it or just fill in yes or no everywhere. So you have to like explain this to them. And what we've seen is like doing this in interview mode or in workshop mode really works best. Explain them the context, explain them the questions and what's behind them. Also really important is that you explain to them that you're not like auditing them. It's like what you need to do is like, we need to understand and help you together with you what your current level is to improve this. And once they get that, they will be much more open in providing you with real answers. So then when you've captured the several like assessments, you will quickly see that it's really hard to like reach higher levels of maturity. Because like level 0 activities most of the times also require some kind of formalization, and it's for a lot of organizations quite difficult to do this. Yes. So sometimes what we see is like, instead of like giving them like zeros all over the place, is like providing some with some adjusted scoring, because they do some level 2 or some level 3 activities. What also helps from time to time, instead of asking a simple plain yes, no, is okay, but how much people of your development organization have received awareness training. For instance, if it's 75%, it will be much more meaningful than simply a no, because not everybody has received it. Yes. Sometimes also, it's really useful to, when you have these questions, and if they're doing a certain activity, is to also go further and see, okay, what's the maturity level of your like coding review activities themselves? And then you can like capture the CMM level of the activity itself. And also, this is really the chance to ask the people themselves what works and what does not work. And it's always very surprising that when they start thinking about this, they really know what's wrong. And capturing this and capturing like quick wins for later on is really crucial in this step. And then once you've captured all these assessments, you will aggregate the results. Sometimes it will be quite difficult because you have different results from different people in the same team even. And that will really depend on how much pressure they were on when you ask them the questions, for instance. It's surprising to see how different questions are when you ask these questions when their manager is in the room or without the manager. Yeah? Or if you ask it to the manager, he says, yes, 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 we do this. And then you ask the same question to the people who actually do the job. Of course not. So you have to like do some reality checking there when you're really doing the validating the results. So repeating the question to several people and like adjusting that to what you think is real. And also what we've explained here is more like the lightweight approach. This is like asking, and based on their answers, it's a yes or a no. You can also go deeper and ask for evidence. This is more like a full approach. Also, it helps from time to time to say, okay, we're going to anonymously gather your responses and aggregate them. So this all helps in making sure you're having a good as-is assessment.
Okay, then the next step of the 4 steps is defining the goal, the to-be model. Where do you want to go as an organization? And this is really where you have to define for the organization, what are the important practices that I want to do, what do I want to achieve as an organization? This is actually where you want to go from an ad hoc approach in an organization where some people are doing some things, other people are doing other things, but it's not very well aligned, into a more structured way of dealing with software security. And actually here, SAMM is very helpful in structuring this, because OpenSAMM provides you with the structure in order to define where you want to go. Now, the time frame of this to-be model, where you want to go, it can vary, but typically you have to think of in terms of like 3 to 5 years. Where, as an organization, do I want to stand in like 3 to 5 years with regarding to software security? Now, in OpenSAMM, you have these scorecards shown here that the colors don't really show very well. But what these scorecards typically represent is you have, for every security practice, you have an as-is state and you have a to-be state. And you represent that for every security practice. So for every security practice, you have done the assessment in the previous step, so you know all the as-is states. And here in the goal, you're going to define all the to-be states. And these scorecards help you in representing this to-be state. It can be helpful for a number of things. You can use these scorecards in a number of different steps throughout the improvements phase for an organization. The first one is to do actually gap analysis. It's very straightforward. You have the as-is, you have the to-be, and you define what's the gap that I should cover in order to reach the to-be. That's very straightforward. So you typically do that before doing implementation steps. Now, you can also do it after the implementation step. If you have implemented some activities, some improvements, you want to convince management that you improved the situation. So in this case, you can again use these scorecards to demonstrate, okay, this is where we were before we did the improvements, and now we actually achieved this. So this is actually the improvements that we did. So in this case, again, the scorecards are very useful in representing what you have achieved. Also, sometimes these scorecards are used in the long term. So once you have achieved improvements, it's important to consistently keep those improvements, because it doesn't make sense to improve something now and then do not pay attention or invest anymore into continuing this, and in the long run, it might disappear again. So again, you can use these scorecards in an ongoing way. So in a repeated times frame, from time to time, assess again, where are we, and are we sure that we are on target for the to-be state where we want to be. Okay, now setting the goal, setting the to-be situation, it's not an easy target. It's not an easy thing to do. What we have learned in doing this, first of all, is that it's very important to link it to the organizational context. So for instance, is there a business case for doing this? From time to time, business cases have already been defined, but often we come into organizations where they ask us, I want to improve my situation, but actually we don't have an idea how to sell this, what's the value that it brings to us, and how can we defend this to higher management. So a business case, defining a business case in this is really important. And a business case is typically linking to drivers or arguments like, okay, an organization needs to be compliant with some kind of regulation, or an organization wants to improve its efficiency with respect to secure development, or you can protect your reputation as an organization. When you would have vulnerabilities in your organization or incidents, do damage protection with regard to reputation. Now, of course, a business case, it's always important to prove return on investment in a business case. And I don't know if you have ever tried to calculate the cost of security in an organization, but you will know that it's really difficult to do. To calculate risk and security or added value of security in an organization is very challenging. Now, there are some resources in doing that. There are some statistics and some there have been written some papers that really show the added value or the improvements that you can do that you can have by implementing these kind of models. There's a number of papers by Microsoft. Cigital has written a number of papers about that. So you have some resources that can help you in defining the business case in that sense. Another thing to take into account is to look into the objectives of the organization. What does the organization want to achieve with implementing this business model, with this assurance model? Is it just the fact that they just want to be compliant with some regulation because otherwise they might lose their license? In a financial institution, for instance, it's very often the case that they want to do exactly this. They have licenses that they want to keep, and they have to prove that they are in line with these licenses, with these regulations. So as an objective in that sense, you have to take that into account in defining the to be. Other organizations might be, actually we don't really care about software security. As long as we don't have public incidents, that's okay for us. It can be a perfect objective for an organization. And you have to take that into account in defining it to be. And of course also the risk appetite of an organization is really important in this. You will know that the risk appetite of organizations varies greatly. Some organizations, actually they don't really care, while others, they have very small risk appetite. Okay, so if you take that into account, all the context, it then boils down to defining what activities you want to implement in this to be model. What we often see is that organizations or people are overshooting where they want to go. So you see these cases where actually you want to achieve the top notch of almost every security practice. That's a bit strange because the implementation effort that it requires to implement all these, especially the level 3 activities, is quite big. And that means if you have such enormous budgets that you want to achieve all these level 3s, you're probably the NSA. Because I don't see a lot of other companies that have really benefit in implementing all the level 3 activities of all the security practices. A good guidance in this is the average security level at the average sector level. So if you're a financial institution, have a look at what other financial institutions are doing in that respect, and try to tailor a bit the to be model according to the average sector level in that sense. Also, the dependencies between practices must be taken into account here. Again, as I said before, the example of the coding guidelines. If you want to do code review, you need coding guidelines. That means that if you want to reach a level 2 for code review, you will definitely have to have a particular level of education and guidance. Otherwise, you won't have those coding guidelines. So there are dependencies in there, and you have to take them into account. And finally, it may seem that you always have to improve your level, but that's not really the case. There might be cases in which is the case that you have reached a particular maturity level as is, but in the long term, for the company, it's not that important to maintain that level. So it might be useful to actually lower a particular level and actually spend more effort on other practices in the maturity model. So it's not always necessary to improve every security practice that you might have. 15 minutes, okay. Okay, very important, and it's linked to the business case as well. Of course, you have to get consensus from the management. If you define a to be and the upper management is not fully aligned with this, it will be very difficult to implement this because it will take quite a bit of effort from the organization. Take the example of Microsoft with their trustworthy computing nodes. It's a perfect example of a company where it works well because they had full support from the upper management level in the company. Typically, when you're going to defend this to upper management, the first question that you will have is budget. How much it's going to cost? Again, for calculating this, it's not that easy to do. In the OpenSAMM model, there are some guidance and there is some information in there regarding budget. How much man days is it going to cost on average for the different stakeholders? Now, if you see that in reality, it's not always very realistic, the estimations that are in there. So you have to really make sure, try to calculate how much it will cost. Again, there are some general statistics that you can use there. For instance, if you're building a security competence center, the average is more or less that you have one person in the competence center per 100 developers, for instance. And it gives you an indication of how many effort you will have to, or how many personnel you will have to put into those security competence center. Okay, and then for big organizations linked to the scope that you have set, for big organizations, it might make sense to create templates for this and spread those templates to the different scopes that you have defined in the organization. If you have selected scopes per organizational unit, you might create one of these as to-be templates and just distribute them to these different groups and kindly ask them to implement it or to take that into account. Okay, the next phase is then the planning. So once you have defined where you want to go, now is the time to reason how you're going to get there. And this is what planning is about. So what does planning do actually? You have an as-is situation where you're starting, you have a to-be where you want to go in the long term, and the planning actually defines a number of intermediate phases to get there. It's as simple as that. OpenSAMM itself includes in the model a number of templates for these plannings, but of course you have to tailor those plannings to your organization. And again, it has to take into account the concrete situation of the organization to be able to make such roadmaps. Let's see what we can use there as advice. First of all, it's useful to identify the quick wins in there. If you're doing a long-term assurance program, and as initial activities, you're going to select activities that will cost a lot of money and are difficult to show the improvement in the organization, it will be very difficult to convince management to continue the exercise. So in that sense, it's really best to focus on the quick wins. What are the activities that don't cost too much in the organization, and where can I directly, immediately prove that it's a benefit to the organization? That's what the quick wins are actually. And so one of these is, for instance, awareness and training. It's a quick win. Why? Because it helps to spread the word to a lot of people because of awareness, and it will immediately increase the level of the people involved in security quite a bit. And it's typically one of those activities that you want to focus on in the beginning of those roadmaps. One other thing to take into account is that the software assurance in itself, it's not an isolated thing. If a company is doing development and releases, you have to, of course, align the OpenSAMM improvements to those releases. So you will have to make sure that the planning aligns with the release cycles of these key applications. That means that if you have release cycles of like every 6 months, it doesn't make sense to have phases in OpenSAMM like for a year or 2 years. It's too long. You have to adapt the planning to the release cycles of your company because that's what's driving this OpenSAMM. Okay, it's of course also the work in the different the improvements that you're doing is actually going to have an impact on different roles in your organization. It might be, there will be impact for developers, for testers, for QA people, for other types of people. And of course, it's also important to spread the work between the different roles and responsibilities almost evenly throughout the organization. If it's the case that in the beginning of the planning, if the beginning of the roadmap, you're putting all the effort in one group, and at the end of the roadmap, you're putting all the effort to another group, it will be very difficult to implement that in practice. So you'll have to spread out over the different groups and over the different roles in the organization. 10 minutes, okay. Take into account dependencies, we've explained that. And for sure, be ready to adapt the planning. Because you will set up a planning for the coming years, and you can be very sure that after a year you might have to steer the planning to other things that have happened in the organization. Okay, some tips about budgeting. We've seen in practice that the overall impact, the average impact on projects is about 5 to 15% for this kind of improvement trajectories. 15% it's really like the startup cost. So in the beginning you will spend more money, but once we have set up a number of activities in place, the cost will typically lower a bit once everything is in place. And on average, on the long term, impacts of budget impact is typically 5% on typical improvement projects. Of course, you have to take into account the cost of tooling and training. It's not only about setting up things, but you have to make sure that people are using them. And also, if you're working with external suppliers, make sure that they're also into the picture, that you know what the impact is on these suppliers as well, because it will have an impact on the contracts that you have with these suppliers. Yeah, and also different technology stacks makes things worse, so there will be an impact there. We're going to have to speed up a little bit.
Yep. So now we have the plan, and now is the next step, and this is implementing. Now, implementing is obviously the hard work, the heavy lifting. Now, there is also, and that's, you've probably seen a lot of other projects and stuff going on at OWASP. What we want to point out here is that there are a lot of OWASP projects that can help you out. For instance, doing education and guidance, WebGo, OWASP education projects going to help you there. So I'm not going to explain each project here in detail, but be aware what we're going to do in the next release of SAMM is to, for each of the activities, give you pointers towards other OWASP projects that you can use as resource to actually implement these. Yes. So in terms of what we've learned is overall, while implementing SAMM, is that you really have to adapt SAMM to your own organization. Just don't blindly follow SAMM, but see what works within your organization and really piggyback on that. If your organization is really test-driven, focus on those activities first, for instance. Also, what's really key here is don't do this for all your applications at the same time. That's not going to work. Focus on your high-risk applications first. Recheck your progress, derive lessons learned at each iteration, make sure that you're ready to adapt your planning while you're implementing. It's really important here. Now, since SAMM is really about measurements, you have to make sure that while you're setting this up and while you're implementing this, is that you make sure that you're reporting this. So create some reporting dashboard and report this to your management so that later on you can check afterwards which activity really worked, which one didn't work, and cross-verify this with the number of vulnerabilities detected in each phase of the development so that you can make it more efficient. Another really important thing to take into account is typically you will have organizations applying some activities on new initiatives, new projects. That's normal. Now, don't forget about the whole legacy and the stuff that works, nobody wants to touch anymore. So make sure that this is not forgotten, but for instance, also don't blindly apply, for instance, source code reviews on your complete legacy code base. That's going to provide you a lot of surprises and a lot of work. So different activities will be required for new projects or for legacy projects. Now, not really explained a lot in OpenSAMM, but you can really also apply this to any kind of development lifecycle. So also in Agile. So we're going to add some guidance in the next release of OpenSAMM on how to apply this on Agile processes. It really depends on how you apply the application security practices. Some of them you will do at every sprint. Some of them you will do for in each of the sprints that require some kind of security activities, or you will have a one security specific sprint. So you can divide these application security practices in Agile processes and steps. Now, What you will also see is when you start implementing SAMM is really like a mixture, and that's not really clear from when you first lead it, but it's really a mixture of people-related activities, process improvement activities, knowledge building activities, and tool-related activities. So you have to like balance out those difficult or like those various activities over the different aspects. So what we've also seen is that unless you have like a driving like competence center behind this, is going to be really difficult. So what we see is that like creating like a central group, like injecting this kind of application security expertise, you really need that, but don't become the bottleneck. You have to like start this up and then distribute this knowledge. So market and promote application security, and do not become like the auditor or the risk function. That's somebody else's responsibility. Help the developers. Sell this to them, that you help them. Do not like become the operational bottleneck. And like, for instance, doing security testing or source code reviews, you can do this like with an application security competence center, but then you have to learn this to the developers themselves and to the QA people so that they can also take up some of that work. Make sure that you spread that knowledge, that you identify people in the development groups or in the QA groups as like champions that are really like, that get this, and that become like local satellites of your application security competence center. So, and that way you create like a community within an organization that knows about application security, and you have much better communication within the organization around application security. So, this is really like, this ends like the quick start and lessons learned. So we've seen assessment, we've seen to-be, we've seen planning, we've seen implementation. Now, some more slides about OpenSAMM itself. We have quite some resources that are available on from the projects. Obviously, we have presentations like these. We have tools like to do worksheet, like assessment worksheets, templates. We have some translations also in other languages. Now the German translation is nearly done, and we have some draft. We hope to publish that on short notice. And also SAMM is being mapped to other SDLC, like related other SDLC activities, like BSIMM or PCI, or is also an ISO standard on application security. So what we've done also, we've done OpenSAMM training that's released like this week. What you also can do is you can start your self-assessment online. There's a guy in Australia called Christian Frichot, and he has like published online a self-assessment tool that you can use yourself. So I'll leave this for you to read to make sure that we have maybe some time for questions.
Okay.
So like very quickly, if you're doing this, make sure that to share your knowledge. If you're doing this and you see things that work, share it with us. You can get involved, obviously, in the project itself. And so donate what works to our project. Thank you very much. Any questions?
So my question is, how do you define or decide of what the activities are? So right now, is it based on your expertise, experience, like what kind of things should be part of the OpenSAMM and what kind of practices should be considered? How is this decided? Based on your expertise?
Just to make sure to repeat your question in the mic, so for
Sure.
that we have.
So my question is, how are the activities and the practices, how do you come up with it? Is it based on your experience or is it based on something else? And specifically, how do you decide which things are level 1 activities and level 2 and level 3s?
I can definitely take it. based on experience foremost, but it's also based on a number of things like dependencies. So for instance, if you have level 1, 2, and 3 activities, it's often the case that for level 2 activities, they actually rely on what has been done in level 1 activities. And so the definition of activities is foremost based on experience and what we see in practice. But the maturity models behind there, the maturity levels in itself behind there is actually the general notion of level 1 is kind of initial, level 2 is kind of more advanced, and level 3 is really mastering. That's the idea behind it. And you also have to work with these dependencies between them. I think those are foremost the driving factors in the OpenSAMM model, I mean. Yeah.
As I've got the mic, you've mentioned the costs of implementing this, but what does the scheme have a system whereby you can value the benefits of imposing this system into a
Yes. So the question is there like a way to measure the benefits? So in each of the activities, there is also success metrics defined. So it really like defines how you measure success and what it really brings in terms of added value to the software development lifecycle. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay.